All right, what up, people? Excited today to have Cody Allen, who by day is the founder and head honcho of Diligence Brands in Shanghai, which I guess operates and runs Baron Shanghai, which is one of the probably the best known and most popular international nightclub out there. And you guys also, correct me if I'm wrong, do a whole bunch of different other restaurants and hospitality ventures too, right?
Yeah, there's another restaurant and then a cocktail bar brand as well that's kind of connected to the cocktail bar is connected to LeBaron as well. So it's two main venues and three brands.
Sweet, sweet. I like to call you hospitality's babyface killer out in China. um, but yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm super interested to get into is because Cody, you've been in Shanghai for what now, like 7 years?
Yeah, about almost 8 years. Yeah.
Okay, so you've really seen the hospitality space and sector and nightlife culture really grow in China, and you've really had a front row seat in that. I also like to think that you've also had quite a contributing hand in that process as well too. So thanks for making the time, man. Really appreciate you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you.
So, dude, tell us your story, man. I mean, you moved to Shanghai 7, 8 years ago, but I mean, sort of knowing you personally, you have one of the more interesting, unique stories I've ever come across.
Um, I moved to Shanghai about 7 8 years ago. Had been previously working with Andre Saraiva, who is the founder of the LeBaron nightclub brand. He's an artist known as Mr. A, and I was running a studio in his company in New York, and that included opening some nightclubs in the States with him. We worked like on the band at the Standard in the Boom Boom Room there. And then we did our own brand in LA called Paul and Andre with Paul Sevigny, another nightclub owner in New York. And it's a long, crazy story, but I met some people based in Hong Kong who were interested in it, were entrepreneurs in their own right, and on the cloth brand and kind of celebrity entrepreneurs. And they really encouraged me and Andre to come and explore things in Hong Kong and in Shanghai. So we did an event for like the reopening of the juice store in Hong Kong, that's kind of attached to cloth. That was 2000, maybe 2011, something like that. And we did that like a LeBaron Kitsune pop-up party in Hong Kong. And that just struck me as a really interesting opportunity to work with that group and to explore options. And at first we intended to explore options in Hong Kong, and then over time, as I started spending more and more time in the region, started spending time in Shanghai, I was just really attracted to Shanghai and where it was at and where I thought it was going. And so close to 8 years ago, I made the decision to move out here from New York, and over time, raise the money, set up the brand of LeBaron here, get the space built out, find the space, get the space built out. And then we've been operating that club for, it'll be 6 years in September. So
Wow.
It took a little while, a year and a half, 2 years to get everything kind of properly off the ground. But yeah, it's been a good, fairly long run now. Yeah.
Yeah, man. I mean, I feel like you guys have almost sort of become an institution there because, obviously you've been around for quite a while, and shall we say, nightlife. I mean, as you know, right? Like in China, it's definitely sort of morphed. I think that when you and I first met, like the sort of Chinese consumer was still, I guess, figuring out what it was that they like to do, when like what it meant to go out, what it meant to party, and all that. And I think that finally, your vision as to what it would eventually be 6 years ago has sort of started to finally kind of happen, right?
Yeah, I think that there's been a big generational shift in the nightlife consumer, and I will say, like, when I speak about the experience, especially of nightlife and anything in China, I'll say that, I'm based in Shanghai, I have a lot of familiarity and experience in the Shanghai market. Some of the things that I observe here are probably applicable across the country or maybe even the region, but I can really only speak to Shanghai itself. I think it's a huge country that's very diverse and has a lot of different types of experiences in a lot of different cities and towns. But yeah, in Shanghai, I think there's been a big generational shift where, and that hasn't happened over the last 6 years. I'd say it's really happened over the last 2 to 2.5 years, where, I think that a certain demographic of people who are now, let's say, in their mid 30s and up, who are really making up the core of the going out, demographic. The people going out 2 to 3 nights a week were, a few years ago, late 20s to early 30s. Now that same demographic of people who had certain sort of references or influences in their style and in their desires for what they have when they go out have now shifted, kind of shifted out of the scene a little bit. I mean, they have children now, companies, and bigger bills, and they can't just be partying 3 nights a week. And what it's been replaced with is like a Gen Z, kind of young millennial Gen Z group, and that group has a really different set of influences and references and came up in a really different time in Shanghai. I think sorry, my cat's here. I have cats all over the place. My experience of that, just to give a quick example, would be, my girlfriend's in her early mid 30s, grew up going out in Shanghai. She's from Shanghai. She grew up going out in Shanghai to places that had, Western style names that were run by Westerners, managed by Westerners, played a lot of Western style music, and where the foreign population of the city were not only could they easily get in, but the club was trying to figure out how to get them more and more in.
Right.
So that also means a lot of girls in high heels and mini skirts and dresses and this kind of European 2000s, 90s, pre-streetwear kind of style. And now what you see, I think, a lot of clubs and a lot of brands in general, restaurants, retail, everything. The kids that are going to that are kind of a generation below that. They're in the early to mid to late 20s, and they are wearing sneakers. The girls are all wearing sneakers, they're wearing t-shirts, they're wearing baseball caps. Streetwear is definitely the trend. Not even just a trend, but the whole lifestyle and identity for a lot of these people. And frankly, it's a lot less related to the West and a lot less related to foreign influence. And, guys dressed in suits and collared shirts aren't getting into the club in Shanghai anymore. And, Chinese kids in Supreme shirts and off-white jeans and fresh kicks are buying tables and spending money. And that's what's dominating the market here. So, I mean, that's, I wouldn't say everywhere is moving in exactly that direction, but I think, if you look at the major nightlife establishments in the city, that's who's dominating them. I'd say, 80% of the customer matches that description. And even 6 years ago, that was not the case. There were a lot of foreigners intermixed in those crowds. There was a lot of attention to kind of foreign styles and music. Now you have a lot of clubs playing a lot of Chinese rap, a lot of Higher Brothers, Jackson Wang, playing, K-pop, playing Blackpink, playing, just a lot more self-referential and looking for other things from within the region of Asia as influences.
Yeah, that's super interesting, man. That's actually one of the things that I really kind of wanted to get your take on, right? Because I think that especially 5 to 10 years ago, and definitely before that, anything that happened in this part of the world that I guess was, it could be defined as contemporary culture, especially outside of Japan, was pretty much almost like a carbon copy, if not a parallel to what was going on in especially the US and Europe, right? Whereas I think that now I mean, to your point about how China's so big and there's so many different facets to all these different subcultures and pockets of contemporary and youth culture that, I mean, invariably with, greater wealth, with just, it coming out of poverty, they're going to create their own, right? I mean, uh, I mean, it's just really interesting that, that you obviously see that from a day-to-day perspective, right? I mean, the fact that there's these, sure, people are wearing Supreme or wearing Off-White, which are obviously brands from the West, but in terms of actually developing their own kind of identity, they're actually kind of taking little bits of all these different, I guess, places of inspiration and really creating their own pretty defined, unique identity, right? Their own sort of subcultural identity, which is totally different from anything that you'll see in the US and Europe.
Yeah, and I kind of used the wrong reference set there for brands. I mean, I'm saying you see plenty of those brands, but you also see like a lot of Ambush, and you see a lot of Roaring Wild and Random Event, and a lot of Japanese, Chinese, Korean brands that are very relevant here. I don't know, I've never done a survey, but I think you'd actually probably see more of those brands right now in terms of just basics and what people are wearing, than you would even, a couple of years ago, it would be Supreme Off-White, and that's not very popular. But in Shanghai, there's definitely a lot of people wearing, a mixture of kind of like, well, you've also seen the major luxury brands go into this field too. So there's all this like Dior, Stussy stuff that you see, and all the Virgil's Louis Vuitton stuff and all that. And so you're seeing like a mixture of that super high-end luxury streetwear influence, and then Chinese and Japanese brands, and Visvim and things like this. I mean, I think that there's definitely like there's still the Western influence, but I think that when I talk to my friends here who are from Shanghai, who are in their 30s and 40s, they still hold and held for their youth like France and Spain and New York to be like the thing. They want to go on holiday to like islands, and they want to spend time in New York. And now I think you see a lot of kids here, like they really think highly of LA. They're maybe slightly less attracted to New York. Europe is like interesting to them, but they don't have this like fetish about Europe that I think the older generation did. I know a lot of people who spend more time, in Tokyo and Niseko and other places in Japan or in Seoul or in Singapore than they do in Europe right now.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the center of gravity for contemporary culture and significance is definitely starting to shift, right?
Yeah, definitely. And like you said, I think it is, they're finding a mixture as opposed to trying to sort of imitate something that's happening somewhere else. They're really finding a mixture of like local brands, regional brands, certain style, and then, the style that's present now in the States is also not like an Americana style. It's not like everyone running around in like polo shorts and Brooks Brothers, so I think that where, people in their 30s and 40s going out here were attracted to like those major European luxury brands, dressing up a lot more. Now you're seeing people attracted to more of the street culture, and certainly like African-American influences in American culture that are like the primary influence in the culture from the West.
Sure. Yeah, man, dude, you bring up so many, just so many like fascinating points there, right? And like, I guess I was first going to ask you sort of what your thoughts were on the potential for, say, the opposite of what's been happening in terms of like the export of Western brands and kind of this idea of holding predominantly Western / for lack of a better term, white signals of cultural currency that being exported to Asia. I mean, do you see at all little bits of the opposite happening? I mean, we see a little bit, right? Like like at the fringe with regards to things like, K-pop and things like Comic-Con being more mainstream, right? But then, I mean, do you see more of that? And like, if so, I mean, is it sort of this confluence of streetwear, like in an Asian sense, or is it something else?
I think you tap on like a major issue that's facing the cultural communication between what just in the world right now. In my experience, for whatever reason, and I don't think it's really malicious, but for whatever reason, you don't see a lot of coverage in Western media about cultural phenomena and movements and interests from China, specifically from China.
Mhm.
So, I think that people in the West are very well acquainted with Japanese culture, both like
Right.
certainly with traditional Japanese culture. And I think a lot of, Americans and Europeans want to travel to Japan at some point in their life and see a tea ceremony and a kabuki show or a no
Yeah.
play or whatever, and see, these Zen temples and all this. And then they also, I think, young people have some awareness of like brands like Ambush and BizVim and White
Yeah.
Mountaineering and Undercover and all this. And there's been a fair amount of coverage, not just on like the hype beasts, but actually like over time, just in mass media. And, there's also a fair amount of coverage, I have to say, of what happens, for example, like in the F&B community in Hong Kong. Like our very deserving friends at Yardbird and Ronin get a lot of press in like New York Times and Condé Nast
Right.
Traveler and Magazine, News. I mean, all these big publications, which are very much deserving of. But the equivalent businesses in China don't get covered, and that is something that I would love to see a change, because I think that the narrative from Western media is really that there's two narratives in China. One is like a narrative about politics and government
Mhm.
that's completely devoid of like human context. And then there's a narrative about crazy stories about money. Like, oh, this guy, there's more female billionaires than in any other
Yeah.
country in the world. This guy bought two 24-karat iWatches for his dog or whatever,
Yeah, it's like
like
power
crazy.
of money, and those are the only things that are talked about, right? Like power
Yeah,
in those sort of hard, non-nuanced sense.
exactly. And there's, but the fact is that, I don't know, close to 100% of the country is living outside of those narratives. 99% of the country
Yeah.
is not engaged in, frankly, like the people are living their lives in a way that is, you would not be able to tell the difference between someone living that life in mainland China and someone living that life in a place like Japan or America, like culturally and what they do every day and what they consume. And, it's maybe in a different language, it's maybe a type of different source, but the pace of life is the same, and the passions are the same and all of this. And so it's weird to me that, this, for example, like Chinese like rap has had this huge moment in China, like in the
Mhm.
last couple of years. There's these big television shows about it, several of them, and streaming shows. That's kind of like, it's like as big as country was in the States, or like I guess still is, or it's this overwhelming like cultural movement that happened for the youth culture in the past several years, and it changed the way that people dress and the music that people consume and the culture. And you don't see a lot of coverage of that community in Western media. And when my friends come here and they come party at Le Baron and they hear like several Chinese rap or like R&B tracks in a night, they're like, what is this music?
Yeah.
And how come we're not experienced? I can't understand what they're saying, but it sounds great. And how come I'm not even aware of that? And there's, I think, so to your question about like when, will you see some of that moving back to the West? I can't really say. I think what it would require first is a willingness from the media and from the consumer in the West to recognize that Asia, and really specifically China as a major force in Asia, is more culturally nuanced and advanced and interesting and engaged and progressive than they're giving it credit for right now. So I think you do see, like you said, K-pop is a great example, but again, I think part of the message around K-pop is like these numbers are crazy. The streaming numbers are
Right.
money is crazy, the fans are crazy, so then the Western entertainment complex is like, okay, K-pop now, that's the thing we're going to push, and I don't know that there has been a lot of appreciation of like Chinese furniture brands and people working with like traditional Chinese techniques, or people doing things in fashion and entertainment here that are worthy of discussion in the West in terms of new models and in terms of new content. So I think that's something that really needs to get addressed. I mean, the pandemic period was a really great example of that. I saw a lot of coverage about Korea. I saw a lot of coverage about Hong Kong and Singapore, and kind of how individual businesses were handling this and how entrepreneurs were getting through it and how companies are handling it. And the message in the Western media about China was, whether or not it was applauding or vilifying, it was just this like one big block, like this is what's happening in China. Not really talking about like, what about the millions and millions and millions of entrepreneurs and how they navigated this and what it means for the brands and what it's doing for the consumers. And, you can't just be like, oh, well, it means that in China, e-commerce is even bigger. Like, okay, true. But what does it mean for these individual entrepreneurs and brands? And I think that type of subtlety is totally lost in Western media, and it affects the way that people perceive China.
Yeah, when you think about how big China is, right? I mean, you add North America, and that like that includes Mexico and Canada, and then you add Europe to that. Like that combined aggregate population is still half of just China, right?
Yeah.
And so like paintbrushing, I think definitely you lose a lot of things. And then to your point earlier about how I guess the West is a lot more comfortable, if you will, with let's just say Japan and Korea. Like versus China, I always felt as if there's two reasons, right? Maybe especially when you're talking about Japan, it's sort of been around longer in the Western conscience, especially like in a modern sense, right? And then also the other thing too is like politically, right? I mean, call it what you want, but to me, like if you look at Japan and Korea, you can sort of make the argument that they're basically vassal states of the U.S., right? I mean, they're protected by the U.S. Navy, right? And so obviously, I think that when you look at particularly Western U.S. centric media, the powers that be, they definitely, I guess, are more maybe open to Japan and Korea, whereas with China, especially now, given these times politically, there's certainly a bias to want to paint China as one way and one thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's where my point has been about, the importance of that narrative about Chinese entrepreneurialism and culture, because, there is, like you said, there is a tendency in the Western media to kind of follow the political story in terms of like, okay,
Right.
this country ally, it's been kind of de-aggressed or something. The situation with our people in our country is copacetic, so therefore we can like let in a lot of information and a lot of exchange between the cultures, tourism and commerce and all these things. And then there's this tendency in the media to kind of like otherize these countries that are either unaligned or not aligned.
Yeah.
And I think that should really be pushed back against. I mean, the political systems can do whatever they want and whatever they feel they need to do. But in terms of the media, especially in the West where there's such a robust free media, the fact that they kind of choose to be blind or ignorant to the cultural narratives and the entrepreneurial narratives and the kind of personal narratives in China, it doesn't help the situation. I think that as you see like the tone of aggression between China and other countries and China and America specifically, like I don't think that that's helped on the American side by a lack of context for the daily lives of Chinese people. I think that there's a kind of there would be a benefit from people understanding more about how kids in Shanghai are living, and how kids in Chengdu are living, and how kids in Shenzhen are living, so that's not going to change overnight. I don't even understand fully why it's happening, and why there's a preference for writing a story about an entrepreneur having an experience in Hong Kong versus in Shanghai. I just see that again and again and again. I don't know why that exists. I also don't think they should lessen coverage of the Hong Kong entrepreneur. I think they should just be including coverage of what's happening here as well. And I think that would help to kind of de-escalate at least the citizens' opinions about these other places. And that doesn't just happen to China. I don't think there's enough coverage of cultural and entrepreneurial movements in Russia, in the United States, or in many other countries. Mexico, even, like, there's Mexico City is like one of the coolest cities in the world, and has such a thriving young entrepreneurial scene, but you don't read very much content about that in American media.
Yeah, and you said one word, which I'm actually gonna have to like steal that one from you, and that's otherize. Because I use the term other, the other a lot, but to actually make that a verb, I think is super, because like it brings together so many things, and especially with what's going on right now with Black Lives Matter movement in the U.S. Right? I mean, it really shines a light on the significance of the other, and how I think so much of contemporary culture, if you just look at America, right, like honestly, most of contemporary culture from America, especially in the past 30 years, pre hip hop, right? There's other stuff in there, right? But then I think especially from, let's say, 1990 onwards, the vast majority of pop culture is coming from hip hop, right? And I think that hip hop, when you and I were growing up, it was a niche thing, and now that is pop culture, and that is all, for the most part, it's from the other, and in the U.S. that's obviously historically predominantly been Black culture, right? And so it's interesting to sort of see these parallels between how, I guess, and this isn't a judgment call, but it's just how you can see, I guess, bits of the other sort of being drawn, but then it's not sort of really getting its full due in a lot of other areas, right? Beyond just entertainment per se, right? Or things of that nature. So I mean, damn, we could really get into that, but kind of wanted just to seg over. You brought up what's been going on with the pandemic, and kind of how that's highlighted and brought to light a lot of different things. Like, I'm just curious. I think that in our private conversations, we've talked about how China's COVID experience has really, I guess, sort of exposed a lot of good things and bad things that you can compare between, let's just say, the Chinese model versus, broadly speaking, the Western model, right? I mean, you being an entrepreneur, you being a business owner, you being somebody in the hospitality space, which is something that was probably hit the hardest and had like the biggest tangible effect immediately from this whole pandemic. I mean, what are some of your thoughts on that? Just kind of how that whole experience has sort of changed or modified your view on the Chinese system versus the U.S. system.
I think that first of all, I think comparing systems is a bit of a minefield that I'll try and stay out of. But I think that what I really realized, which was a really inspiring thing, albeit a little bit difficult. I saw a piece in the New York Times, like right when mid-March, when things were really heating up in the States with the virus, and it was getting to be very clear that there would need to be some type of lockdown in major cities, and a group of, like, a panel of epidemiologists, either interviewed by the New York Times or wrote a message letter to the New York Times, and said, look, if we could completely shut down the country for 3 weeks and have no one leave their living room, then the pandemic would just die out. It wouldn't exist anymore after that. And they were like, well, obviously this is impossible. So that's basically what happened in China. Basically, everything actually stopped. I think there was, in uh, lucky is not the word, but actually everything shutting down during Chinese New Year actually turned out to maybe be a benefit, because a lot of businesses are already winding down anyway. So, rather than in the middle of March or September, whatever, having to like put a complete stop on the entire economy, which would be difficult to do, some of that was winding down anyway. And a lot of the cities just extended that closure. I think the really key difference though is that, I viscerally remember January 22nd, January 23rd, January 24th in Shanghai, when it was becoming very clear that there was a serious issue, when the government here was starting to really talk about it, and then they shut down Wuhan on the 23rd.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a dinner on the 22nd with like 12 people to celebrate a Chinese New Year thing, and all of us showed up in masks, and no one planned to do anything in their social life except for go to work. So this was like before there was any type of a shutdown, before there was any type of a real, like a 5-alarm fire level situation. The people around me, we were already lessening our social interaction, lessening our risks, wearing masks, washing hands, everyone had a hand sanitizer, or a few people in the room, and I don't think that that's something that's even happening now today, even as the virus is still raging in a lot of countries.
Right.
So I think that, when people talk about the Chinese system here and its response to the coronavirus, it was very effective in many ways, and I won't take anything away from that. But I think that also the society, the people themselves, there was not a point in Shanghai where the government in Shanghai said you cannot leave your home. It is true that there were individual complexes or landlords or sub-districts that had very, very strict regulation on that. But for example, in my area, in my district, and in most of my friends' districts and buildings, they were able to leave and they were able to go out and do things, but they didn't. And it wasn't even for like 14 days. It was for like 45 or 50 days. And there was not any, I didn't hear a lot of, I personally, I didn't hear any complaining about the situation, but I'm sure there were people complaining. And, there was just the kind of some level of common sense, I guess, that said, okay, look, we stay in our house, this thing gets better. If we leave our house, we can get sick, we can get other people sick, and we can perpetuate this thing that has no easy answer. So there was definitely a willingness from the people to do that. Now, I think that, what you saw in the US and in certain other countries was there's the first reaction when you're told something is to rebel against that thing. And I don't think that same thing is really present in the culture here. I know individuals who do rebel against everything that they're told, but in general, when you walked in the streets on those weeks, they were dead. People weren't going out. People didn't want to go out. They were scared. They were concerned. It was a very scary thing here at the beginning because no one knew what they were dealing with until more and more information came out and scientists understood more about the condition, virus. But so I think that gave me a lot of hope in a couple ways. And I think that, the lesson for me in that was the system is one thing, but the society in which the system is being applied is also very, very important in a situation like that, and frankly, my friends in the West were very, very surprised to hear I was okay with wearing masks all the time. And so I'm still wearing a mask, and a lot of people in Shanghai are wearing masks. And I just wear it because I know some people are freaked out about foreigners maybe bringing the virus, even though the borders are closed. Like, there's still some fear about that. And I'm just like, man, whatever, I'll just wear a mask. Like, it's like better for me. It's like slightly hot on my face, but it lessens my chance of getting sick, and everyone else feels comfortable. I think there's a lot of that thinking in the culture here. And so the measures taken from a system perspective were actually quite effective in a lot of ways, because people were, had some
More
common
receptive
sense
to it,
about it.
kind of get it. Yeah, like you said,
Mhm.
common sense. I mean, and without getting into too much, because this is just a rabbit hole. Um, but I mean, why do you think that is? I mean, why do you think this sort of Western world hubris exists, like culturally?
Oh man, I don't know. I really don't know. If I knew, I would probably still live there. I don't know. I I I think I think that one thing, which you can say that's compassionate on both sides, is that especially the U.S., maybe less so Europe, but the U.S. has not faced a lot of massive existential, life-threatening threats
Right.
in the last, well, like in a very long time. Even the world wars were kind of primarily held off
Right.
mainland United States. And and that's not the case in Asia, really, for any country in Asia. So I think that first of all, there was in the West some type of an inability to imagine that something like this could happen.
Hmm.
And then on top of that, maybe an inability to imagine that your system or your leaders or your society wouldn't be up to the challenge somehow. And I I think that was very damaging to the response in the West, especially in the United States. And I think that the kind of difficulties that have been faced by a lot of Asian nations in the 20th century uh, benefited them at this time in a kind of disaster mentality. First of all, I think they believed something really big and horrible could happen.
Right.
And then they weren't sure how it would play out, and they know that chaos is not I think they expected some level of chaos, so they also took a lot of personal responsibility. It's like, oh well, who knows how this is going to play out and how it's going to be handled by governments all over the region and the world. So I personally need to stay home and be safe and not get me and my family sick.
Yeah.
I think that in a more like in a less kind of existential level, China also probably benefited that there's a lot of people who live with their elders, and who live with their families or see their families like, every multiple times a week or every
Right.
week. There's a lot of my friends in the West that live far away from their parents and their grandparents and only see them occasionally. And it's not at all uncommon, to move to another state. And I think in China, in Shanghai, for example, my friends in Shanghai see their parents a lot. They see their grandparents a lot. And there's also a lot of elderly people on the street. There's a lot of Shanghai is a city kind of like New York with a lot of walking and a lot of street life. And that street life is not entirely, but very much dominated by senior citizens.
Right.
So, there's also some like respect of like when you find out that this thing affects senior citizens, let's not all hang out on the street next to a bunch of senior citizens and potentially get them sick. There's some level of compassion there that I think probably comes from people's living more closely with their elders in their household.
That makes a lot of sense. So for you personally right now, right? I mean, like, what's it like on the ground over there? I mean,
Yeah, it's great. I got to be honest. Like, it's like probably the best place to be in the world right now. Shanghai in general did not get hit hard by this virus. There were only 300 something, cases of community spread. I think now there's been like 400 something, with all of the imported cases. I can't
wow.
quite recall the figures, but the imported cases are kind of handled at the airport and quarantined and put into hospital treatment, and no imported cases have died. I think 4 people have died in Shanghai from the disease, and the virus only infected I don't recall, I think 370 people.
Yeah.
So there also hasn't been there's been these two incidences of like small community spread where someone came back from another city like Guangzhou, and she came back from a business trip and got her husband sick, but they found that right away, and they no one else got sick, and didn't become a cluster. There's been two examples of that since March 1st, but other than that, there's been no cases of community spread since March 1st, which is so early. I mean, you think that there's been no cases of community spread in Shanghai since 2.5 weeks before New York went into full lockdown. You know? So we're really far ahead. I think China in general is really far ahead in the process compared to most other countries. And Shanghai might be the farthest ahead, or one of the farthest. I think Chengdu also opened up very early. So Shanghai feels very, very normal, and has for a long time. I don't mean normal like irresponsible. There's still, like, I think, a higher level of care happening here than in a lot of other countries where the virus is more present. There's temperature checks and health code checks and all this type of stuff happening in a lot of buildings. You're seeing that less and less, but it's still randomized. So you still need to kind of, if you're sick, you're going to encounter it at some point. I mean, no matter who you are, you're going to encounter it at some point. But in terms of business, you know, obviously we're living in a country that has totally closed borders. No foreigners can come in right now. If I leave, I can't come back in until the borders open. We don't know when the borders are going to open. That obviously affects some level of every industry. I think in certain industries, it is creating a kind of positive hyper demand of some sort, you know, that people aren't traveling and they're going to be stuck in China throughout probably the summer. So are they going to travel domestically? Are they going to spend domestically?
Right.
It is, I think it's,
that entertainment budget has to go somewhere, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think, you know, there's a lot of people who are not deeply affected financially by this episode. I think that there are, you know, there's a lot of people held on to their jobs. A lot of people have some savings here and were able to get through this time. The super wealthy, I don't think have, you know, for sure their income is affected by it, but, you know, they're incredibly wealthy. They're not going to stop spending on, you know, family holidays or going out at night just because of a 1 to 2 year recession of some sort. And I don't think, and there isn't a recession here either, it seems, or there likely will not be. So, you know, it feels very hopeful. It feels very positive. Everyone I know is very, 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 very grateful to be here during this time, both to have been here through the virus and also for the recovery. I think that from the earliest days of the virus through to now, I have not heard of many places in the world that have handled it better than the city of Shanghai. So there's a lot of gratitude from people that I know for being here.
Yeah. So like, I guess this is a bit of a two-pronged question, but sort of related to what you were just saying. But you know, given kind of what you've been seeing and given kind of how I guess just you know your sort of average consumer behaviors has adapted during this time. How do you see the sort of future of what you do, hospitality and entertainment, kind of evolving? And in that same vein, do you see your future being you know, continuing to be more in China or more in Asia, or do you see yourself going back to the US?
First, about the industry in general, I think I'd say there's 3 different parts of food and beverage here. There's nightlife and entertainment, which is its own sector. Then there is within food and beverage, like at restaurant businesses, there's Chinese and there's Western.
Okay.
I would guess that there is going to be considerable uptick in interesting Chinese concepts and people willing to invest money in Chinese food. There's probably going to be a decrease both in Western entrepreneurs in China right now that are interested in starting Western food businesses. And I think, frankly, that Western restaurants have not fared as well as Chinese restaurants through the recovery. Not to say that, you know, my Western restaurant is doing fine and is in a sustainable and positive place, but my friends with big Chinese restaurants are, you know, 90% back, or some of them are even up over last year. So there's that. I think on the nightclub side and nighttime entertainment side, so you see a big push right now from Shanghai City for the nighttime economy. Basically, that boils down to an attempt to extend the hours in the day when people are spending money and employing people. And that's not just nightclubs, it's also like night markets. They're getting back into kind of like allowing and supporting like food stalls, night markets, kind of like, you know, you see those famous night markets in Taiwan, there's some in Hong Kong, same thing. So, so they're getting, you know, a lot of that was kind of cleansed out of the cities here in an attempt to kind of clean up the cities here, and a lot of that's being supported again now with official government policy. There was just a big nightlife festival this past weekend in Shanghai. It's like a month-long engagement, but last weekend had a bunch of activations across big real estate developments and nightclubs and things like this. And nightlife is it feels like it's booming in Shanghai. I think part of that is that not all cities have all their nightclubs open again. Like Beijing is not fully reopened yet, and like Shenzhen opened a bit later, I think, than other places. Chengdu and Shanghai opened maybe earlier than other cities, but I know, you know, there's a lot of new nightclubs opening in the next 6 months to a year. And I will be honest, I'm shocked about that investment, because having just navigated a nightclub business through a 3-month closure, you know, starting a new one was not the first thing on my mind. And I'm surprised that people are, but then, you know, I look at a lot of those people's businesses, they're core businesses, and they're not cash flow heavy businesses. And I think that one thing that everyone has come to appreciate after a 3-month shutdown is cash flow, and a business where you can turn cash flow back on and just get it replenished very quickly. And so that's where I think you're seeing a boom in nightlife investment. I think there's going to be more nightclubs, more bars. It is, you know, an interesting thing to see in a time, as I said, when the country is closed, the borders. There's not that much DJ or entertainment talent in the country, and everyone's having to share a lot of it. Tax, which is a major club in Shanghai, has done something pretty innovative where they've lined up live streams or pre-recorded sets by huge, like top 100 DJs, and live stream them in the club on huge screens, and it's gone very well, and they're having a lot of success right now. You also see major clubs that specialize in EDM, like Beehive just did the Higher Brothers Live last Saturday night, you know, so they're kind of investing in bigger acts and performances and things like this from within China. I don't know where that's going. I think people are kind of just banking on the fact that things are going to open up more and more, and the borders are going to open, and there's going to be a lot of demand for people to be in Shanghai. To answer the second part of your question in terms of my own kind of focus, you know, I think that, as I expressed earlier, I think it's really important that there be a solid and consistent and detailed cultural exchange and communication between entrepreneurs and cultural leaders in the entertainment businesses, specifically in America and China, but more broadly between the East and the West. And I'm very keen on continuing to work in different fields and businesses and strategies that allow me to help to be of service to that cause and keep perpetuating that communication. I think, you know, Liberon has been a really special business in a lot of ways. And I don't know that I would seek to kind of recreate that exact thing again. So there are a lot of concepts I've been talking about over the last couple of years that maybe we'll get engaged into investing in this year or early next year. But I've been thinking a lot over the last several months about just what are different ways to encourage more cultural exchange and entrepreneurial exchange between the countries. And getting a lot more information on both sides, especially information about China going to the States, because I think people are basically flying blind. I think that all countries and all cultures have had some type of a obligation that they themselves feel to like stay up on America over the past 50 years.
Yeah.
But I think that America has felt that about really anyone else, like, which is part of its cultural issue. But I think it's gotta, in an increasingly interconnected world, and just after what we're seeing right now in the States in a lot of different ways, not just with the virus, but with popular protest movement and all this, there should be more global conversation in America, and America should have a more open mind about what's going on in other countries and other societies and what's working for other people and what's interesting. And I think there's a lot of people in America interested in that who still have trouble getting that information from China. So I would like to work in that field. In terms of going back to America, I really don't know. I am not in like the most positive mindset as an American about America right now.
Tell me about it.
And I don't want to go on record saying that much more about that, because that's kind of a personal bone to pick a little bit that I don't necessarily know is like for everyone. But right now I do not have any intention on moving back full time to the States or anything like that. I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity between the countries. I also think that there's a lot of other countries in the world that are very interesting, that maybe come with a little bit less baggage than this kind of bipolar relationship between the US and China. I think obviously my life and my business is going to remain in China, and I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm very keen on continuing to invest in the country and with my time and my businesses, and grow my teams and work with people here and have more collaboration. So I think that's going to be a constant in my life for at least the foreseeable future, if not forever. But I don't know what that means for my interaction with other countries and other markets. I think that frankly, we've got to wait and see what those other markets look like this time next year, or even this time the year after. The situation was really different 9 months ago, and I would have told you probably an answer to that question 9 months ago than I would now.
I feel you, man. Look, I know we're running short on time here, but before we leave, you spoke a little bit about your hospitality background in New York, boom boom room, working at the Standard, all that, but you have a crazy story before that. Just entertain us, indulge us a little bit. Tell us a little bit about that, man.
Yeah, I think like a series of what at the time seemed to be really unfortunate events, doing things out of financial necessity, and that combined with very open-minded, progressive, and supportive parents, definitely gave me an I guess an odd story. I mean, yeah, in short, I moved from normal. So I grew up in Massachusetts. I moved out of going to day-to-day school and started doing independent study, homeschool, when I was 14. And I started making snowboard films when I was really young, at 14, 15. And I made 3 of those and worked a lot with all the major snowboard brands, and traveled with a lot of the young guys who were, my age or a bit older, who are now Olympic medalists and have contributed a lot to the sport. And I had a blast doing that, but I really got engaged at that time in being really interested in like Spike Jonze and what he'd done with his career, moving from kind of skateboarding into different types of content. And I decided I wanted to be in film production in a different way. And I went and started working at a company called Anonymous Content in Los Angeles.
Okay.
I worked in the new media. I started as an intern there and then kind of worked my way up. I was there for about 4 years, a little over 4 years. Worked in the new media division there, and through the new media division and clients we worked with, we worked on this Belvedere campaign that Andre, who founded Le Baron, was like the face of and all this collaboration for, and I got to know him through that. I also worked for a time, so after I left Anonymous, I started a company with him called Mr. Andre that ran the business of his studio and his collaborations in the United States. He was based in France at the time. And I also started working at that time with a good friend of mine named Willow Perron, who's a creative director and does all the tours and events and kind of album covers and music video creative direction with Jay-Z and Rihanna and Kanye and Gaga and Florence and the Machine and Drake. And he did like the Drake tour with like the Ferrari, Flying Ferrari. He did all the last 2 Jay-Z album covers and tours and all the festival stuff. And so that was a wild experience for like a year or 2 working with him. But in the end, I decided music wasn't, my family was a bit in the music business. And I was just like, yeah, maybe music is not the business I need to be in. And I kind of ended up in some version of it anyway, in hospitality and then specifically in nightlife. But that's basically how I ended up there. Yeah. So I actually never finished high school and didn't attend university, obviously. That's why I would say that is like, some of it was definitely like familial financial necessity in terms of me continuing to work at a young age. But then the other part is just really supportive parents that saw that I had a passion for this and kind of let me take my own path on it. So yeah, it's been a wild ride and totally unexpected.
That's such a dope story. That's awesome. I love hearing that. Okay, this is the very last part. Quick fire. All I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you a bunch of either or questions. There's like 7 or 8 of them. All right.
Okay.
Start off with Burton or K2?
Say that again?
Burton or K2?
Burton.
Boom Boom Room or Laban?
I have a very soft spot for the Boom Boom Room. I love that. I love that place at the time.
Ibiza or Berlin?
I've never been to Ibiza. So Ibiza, because I've never been.
New York or LA?
Oh, that's really, really, really difficult. I have fantasized about moving back to LA a lot since I lived in China. But actually just seeing what New York just went through in a way, it made me really miss New York. And it's just an amazing place. And they're just amazing people there. And that city is never going to change. It's always going to be awesome.
The NBA or the NFL?
The NBA, without question. Not even
Same here. Same here. For a whole host of reasons apart from just the sport.
Yeah, exactly.
Old school hip hop or the new stuff?
It's all good, man. It's such a progressive form. I definitely listen to more what I guess now would be considered old school hip hop than new stuff. I get exposed to a lot of the new stuff on a weekly basis at the club, which is a great part of having a club. You just hear new music. And there's a lot of energy in it. It's great. I probably listen on my own to more what would now be considered old school.
In places where it's legal, weed or booze?
I don't participate in either of them anymore. I haven't had drink. So
you're on that health. Yeah, you're on that health streak. Niseko or Verbier?
Niseko, no question. Verbier is amazing, but for snowboarding Nisekos, there's just nowhere like it.
Okay, well then I guess there's no point in asking you Niseko or Aspen or Whistler then. It's Niseko, right? Takes the cake.
Culturally, and its proximity to where I live and the snow quality and the culture there and the kind of scene and how laid back it is just so great.
Shanghai or Tokyo?
really different places. Shanghai for living, I think for sure, but there's nothing like Tokyo. I mean, it's just, Tokyo is also the first city I ever went to in Asia, which is just a crazy experience. I actually think Tokyo first and before they go anywhere else. It's such a wild place. One of the best things about being in Asia is the proximity of all the places. You can just get to cities normally during normal times so quickly, and so I do spend quite a bit of time in Tokyo, but I've never worked there, and I imagine that would be quite complicated. So I'd say for living, Shanghai's hard to beat.
Fair enough, man. Well, yo, man, that's it. Appreciate you taking the time, man. Like, keep doing, what you're doing. For me being a friend, I just think that, yeah, like, you're one of the people that I always think is just, not only coming at things with a lot of creative energy, but you always do things the right way, and I appreciate that, man. So thanks again for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to talk.
All right, man. Sweet. Much love.